My father thinks you need a wife. The words drifted across the ballroom like a spark landing in dry grass, and within seconds, every conversation at the table seemed to disappear. Some people smiled. Others exchanged curious glances. A few quietly waited for the struggling single dad to look embarrassed. What nobody expected was that his answer would leave one of the most powerful women in America completely speechless. The grand ballroom of the Hayes Foundation shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers imported from Italy decades earlier. Soft piano music floated through the air while servers moved between tables carrying trays of sparkling water and carefully prepared appetizers. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of downtown Chicago stretched across the night like a sea of stars. Inside, nearly 400 executives, investors, philanthropists, and public figures gathered for the annual charity gala hosted by Hayes Holdings. At table 17, Ethan Walker felt slightly out of place. Not because he lacked confidence. Not because he was intimidated. But because men like him usually spent Friday nights helping their daughters with homework, repairing kitchen cabinets, or preparing lunches for the next school day. Not sitting among billionaires. Ethan adjusted the cuff of his navy jacket. It was the same suit he had worn for 3 years. Clean. Well kept. Nothing flashy. Across from him sat Charlotte Hayes, CEO of Hayes Holdings. 35 years old. Brilliant. Admired. Feared in boardrooms from New York to San Francisco. Her tailored emerald gown reflected the warm glow of the chandeliers while a diamond pendant rested lightly against her collarbone. She carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in every room she entered. Yet tonight, her attention remained fixed on Ethan. "You seem uncomfortable," she said. Ethan smiled faintly. "Not uncomfortable. Just aware that my truck is probably worth less than the flowers on this table." A few guests laughed politely. Charlotte tilted her head. "You always answer questions like that?" "Only when the truth is cheaper than pretending." More laughter followed. But Charlotte didn't laugh this time. She simply studied him. That was becoming a habit lately. Across the ballroom, Richard Hayes watched from a distance. The founder of the company had spent months encouraging his daughter to spend time with Ethan. Charlotte considered it ridiculous. Richard considered it necessary. "You're watching them again," one board member observed. Richard smiled. "Some investments take longer than others." Back at the table, conversation drifted toward mergers, acquisitions, and market forecasts. Ethan remained mostly silent. Not withdrawn. Simply uninterested in competing for attention. He listened. He nodded. He spoke only when he had something worth saying. The quality grew increasingly rare the wealthier the room became. Then Charlotte placed her wine glass on the table and leaned slightly forward. The movement immediately drew attention. Nearby conversations softened. Several guests looked toward her. Even the pianist seemed quieter somehow. Charlotte's lips curved into a small smile. "You know," she began, "my father said something very interesting about you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerous." A ripple of laughter moved through the table. Charlotte continued. "He said you need a wife?" This time the laughter arrived louder. Several executives chuckled openly. One woman nearly spit out her drink. Charlotte appeared amused by the reaction. Ethan looked down briefly at the white linen tablecloth. Then he looked back up. Calm. Steady. Unhurried. "Maybe your father is right," he said. The laughter faded. Charlotte's smile widened slightly. Then Ethan added softly, "But I'm not looking for someone impressed by my need." Silence. Immediate. Complete. Charlotte's expression froze. Around them, the room continued moving, glasses clinked, music played, servers walked between tables. Yet for one brief moment, it felt as if everything had stopped. And for the first time that evening, the CEO who always had the next answer found herself with none. Charlotte Hayes had faced hostile investors, aggressive competitors, and television interviewers who built careers around asking impossible questions. Yet none of them had unsettled her the way one quiet sentence from Ethan Walker had only moments earlier. Around the gala table, conversation slowly resumed. Forks touched plates. Glasses clinked softly. Someone near the stage laughed at a joke. But Charlotte found herself staring at the man beside her, trying to understand why his words still echoed in her mind. Ethan, meanwhile, seemed completely unaffected. He reached for his water glass, thanked a passing server, and listened as two executives discussed a real estate acquisition worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He did not try to impress anyone. He did not mention achievements. He did not compete for attention. In a room filled with people determined to be noticed, Ethan somehow became impossible to ignore. The strange thing was that this was exactly how he lived every day. 40 miles outside Chicago, in the small town of Maple Creek, Ethan's life looked nothing like the glamorous ballroom surrounding him tonight. His mornings began at 5:30. Not because he enjoyed waking up early, but because responsibility rarely waited for comfort. Every weekday he prepared breakfast for his daughter before the sun fully rose above the tree line behind their modest two-bedroom home. Pancakes on Saturdays. Oatmeal on school mornings. Scrambled eggs whenever Lily had a spelling test because she insisted eggs made her smarter. Ethan never corrected her. Some beliefs were worth protecting. By 7 o'clock he was driving his aging pickup truck through town. The heater rattled during winter. The air conditioning struggled every July. But the truck always started. Like Ethan himself. Reliable. Quiet. Consistent. His woodworking shop sat on the corner of Main Street beside an old bakery that smelled permanently of cinnamon and fresh bread. The sign above the door simply read Walker Custom Woodworks. Nothing fancy. Inside, shelves held handcrafted tables, rocking chairs, bookshelves, and cabinets built entirely by hand. Ethan believed quality mattered because people trusted their lives to the things they brought into their homes. Over the years, customers learned something else. If Ethan gave his word, it meant something. Mrs. Reynolds, the retired schoolteacher, still told people about the winter he repaired her broken front porch without charging $1. The Peterson family remembered how he spent an entire weekend rebuilding their dining table after flood damage. The local pastor often joked that Ethan performed more community service than half the town combined. Ethan never viewed those moments as sacrifices. He simply saw people. And when people needed help, he helped. Back in the ballroom, Richard Hayes watched his daughter watching Ethan. A knowing smile touched the older man's face. He remembered the first time he met Ethan nearly a year earlier. A storm had damaged a historic wooden gazebo on Richard's property. Several contractors submitted expensive proposals. Ethan arrived with a tape measure, a notebook, and practical solutions. When the project ended under budget, Richard offered him a generous bonus. Ethan politely declined. "You already paid me exactly what we agreed on," he had said. That answer alone had earned Richard's respect. Tonight, however, Richard was beginning to suspect that Ethan had earned something far more difficult. Across the table, Charlotte finally looked away from Ethan and toward the ballroom crowd. Yet, for reasons she could not explain, none of the powerful men in expensive suits seemed nearly as interesting as the single father quietly holding a glass of water beside her. Long before the gala, before Charlotte Hayes found herself replaying Ethan Walker's words in her mind, Richard Hayes had already made a decision. He simply had not told anyone. Nearly a year earlier, a severe spring storm swept through the countryside surrounding his private estate north of Chicago. Powerful winds damaged several structures on the property, including a historic cedar gazebo that had stood beside the lake for more than 40 years. Insurance inspectors came and went. Contractors submitted proposals. Consultants discussed restoration plans. Most of them focused on costs, timelines, and profit margins. Then someone recommended a local craftsman from Maple Creek. Richard expected another contractor. Instead, Ethan arrived in an old pickup truck carrying a tape measure, a notebook, and a thermos of coffee. No sales presentation. No polished speech. No attempt to impress. He spent nearly an hour examining the structure before speaking. Can it be saved? Richard asked. Ethan nodded. Yes. Will it be expensive? Ethan studied the damaged beams. Less expensive than replacing it. How long? About 3 weeks if the weather cooperates. Richard smiled slightly. You seem very certain. Ethan returned the smile. Wood usually tells you what it needs if you listen long enough. That answer stayed with Richard. Over the following weeks, he visited the site several times. Each visit revealed something unusual. Ethan arrived before most workers. He treated employees with respect. He never rushed. He never cut corners. One afternoon, Richard noticed Ethan speaking on the phone while sanding a railing. His voice immediately softened. Did you remember your science project? He asked. A pause followed. Then Ethan laughed quietly. Good. I will be there at 6. I promise. Richard realized he was talking to his daughter. Another afternoon, Richard found Ethan sitting alone on the unfinished gazebo steps eating a simple turkey sandwich. You should charge more for your work, Richard commented. Ethan shrugged. Why? Because people would pay it. Ethan looked toward the lake. Sunlight shimmered across the water while a pair of ducks drifted near the shore. Just because someone can pay more does not mean they should have to. Richard laughed softly. You know that is not how most businesses operate. Maybe that is why most people do not trust businesses. The older man found himself smiling again. Weeks later, the project was completed. The restored gazebo looked even better than before the storm. Every detail reflected patience, craftsmanship, and care. Richard invited Ethan into his office and handed him an envelope. Ethan opened it, glanced at the amount, and immediately pushed it back across the desk. There is a mistake. No mistake, Richard replied. Consider it a bonus. Ethan shook his head. You already paid the agreed amount. You earn more. That was never our agreement. Richard stared at him for several seconds. Most people would have accepted the money before he finished speaking. Some would have asked for more. Ethan simply stood there, calm and comfortable with enough. As Ethan prepared to leave, Richard asked one final question. Tell me something. Why are you so different from everyone else? Ethan paused near the doorway. For a moment he seemed to consider the question carefully. Then he answered. Because my daughter is always watching. The office fell quiet. After Ethan left, Richard remained seated behind his desk for several minutes. He had spent decades building $1 billion company. Yet somehow a small-town single father had just taught him something about character. And that was the day Richard Hayes decided his daughter needed to meet Ethan Walker. Richard Hayes never told Charlotte about the real reason he kept mentioning Ethan Walker. At first she assumed her father simply admired the craftsman who had restored the gazebo. Then he mentioned Ethan again during breakfast. And again during a board meeting. And again during a Sunday afternoon walk around the estate. Eventually Charlotte became suspicious. You talk about him more than some executives, she said one afternoon. Richard smiled over the rim of his coffee cup. That is because some executives are easier to replace. Charlotte rolled her eyes. He builds furniture. He builds trust, Richard replied. That is much harder. Charlotte dismissed the comment. In her world, success was measured through performance reports, growth strategies, and quarterly earnings. Character mattered, of course. But character did not usually determine billion-dollar decisions. At least that was what she believed. A few weeks later Richard invited Ethan to a private luncheon at the estate. Charlotte happened to be there reviewing documents for an upcoming acquisition. When Ethan arrived, she barely looked up from her tablet. She expected another small-town contractor eager to impress wealthy clients. Instead, she found a man who seemed completely comfortable being himself. Ethan greeted the staff by name. Thanked the groundskeeper for holding a door open. Complimented the chef on the meal. None of it appeared calculated. It was simply who he was. Throughout lunch Richard asked questions. Ethan answered honestly. They discussed business, family, community projects, and life in Maple Creek. Several times Charlotte waited for Ethan to mention financial struggles or ask for opportunities. He never did. By dessert, she found herself strangely irritated. Most people wanted something from the Hayes family. Access. Influence. Money. Connections. Ethan seemed interested only in finishing his coffee before driving home to his daughter. Later that afternoon, Charlotte decided to test him. "Your workshop could expand," she said as they walked through the estate gardens. "Probably. You could open additional locations. Maybe. I know investors who would fund that." Ethan glanced toward a bed of white roses moving gently in the breeze. "Why?" Charlotte frowned. "Because growth creates opportunity. Growth also creates complications." She stared at him. "You make ambition sound like a problem." Ethan smiled. "Not a problem. Just not always the answer." The response bothered her more than she expected. A month later she tried again. This time she arranged for one of her executives to offer Ethan a lucrative consulting contract connected to a luxury development project. The compensation exceeded what many people earned in a year. Ethan reviewed the proposal carefully before returning it. "The money is generous," he said. "But the travel would keep me away from Lily too often." "Most people would accept immediately," the executive replied. Ethan nodded. "That is probably why most people are not Lily's father." Word of the refusal eventually reached Charlotte. She sat quietly in her office overlooking downtown Chicago. Below her, traffic flowed through the city streets like rivers of light. She should have been annoyed. Instead, she felt something unfamiliar. Curiosity. Every attempt to impress Ethan seemed to fail because he was not measuring life by the same standards as everyone else. For the first time in years, Charlotte Hayes encountered someone she could not predict. And although she would never admit it aloud, that uncertainty was becoming impossible to ignore. Lily Walker met Charlotte Hayes on a rainy Saturday afternoon, and neither of them realized how much that meeting would change everything. The sky above Maple Creek hung low and gray as steady rain tapped against storefront windows along Main Street. Ethan had spent the morning finishing a custom dining table while Lily sat in the corner of the workshop working on a school art project. The scent of fresh-cut oak mixed with the aroma of coffee drifting from the bakery next door. It was the kind of ordinary day Ethan appreciated. Predictable. Peaceful. Honest. Shortly after noon, a sleek black sedan pulled up outside the workshop. Lily noticed it first. "That car looks expensive," she announced. Ethan glanced through the window and immediately recognized Charlotte stepping out with an umbrella. "You are not wrong," he replied. Moments later, the bell above the shop door chimed softly. Charlotte entered, carefully avoiding a puddle near the entrance. Her tailored coat and polished shoes looked entirely out of place among stacks of lumber and woodworking tools. Lily studied her curiously. Charlotte noticed the little girl and smiled. "Hello?" Lily smiled back. "Hello?" Ethan set down a measuring tape. "What brings a chief executive officer all the way to Maple Creek?" Charlotte folded her umbrella. "I was nearby." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You were 40 miles away from nearby yesterday." Lily giggled. To Charlotte's surprise, she found herself laughing too. The tension immediately softened. As Ethan returned to a workbench, Charlotte wandered through the showroom examining handcrafted furniture. Every piece carried small details that reflected patience and care. Nothing was mass-produced. Nothing was rushed. Meanwhile, Lily quietly approached her holding a sketchbook. "Do you want to see something?" Charlotte hesitated before kneeling beside her. "Of course." For the next 20 minutes, Lily enthusiastically flipped through drawings of animals, school projects, and future dream houses. Charlotte listened politely at first. Then genuinely. One drawing showed a small white house with flowers beneath every window. Another featured a giant tree house connected by bridges. A third showed Ethan standing beside Lily while holding a fishing rod nearly twice his height. "Your dad looks like a superhero," Charlotte observed. Lily nodded without hesitation. "He is." The answer arrived so quickly that Charlotte felt something shift inside her. There was no doubt in Lily's voice. No uncertainty. Only complete trust. Later that afternoon, Ethan left briefly to help a customer load furniture into a truck. For the first time, Charlotte found herself alone with Lily. Rain continued tapping softly against the windows. The workshop felt warm and inviting despite the weather outside. "Can I ask you something?" Charlotte said. Lily nodded. "Why does your dad never seem worried?" Lily thought carefully. "He worries." "He does. Sometimes." She pointed toward a framed family photograph resting on a shelf. It showed Ethan, Lily, and a smiling woman with bright eyes. "He just does not want me to carry things that belong to grown-ups." Charlotte looked at the photograph. "Your mom?" Lily nodded. "Daddy says she taught him how to be brave." The words settled quietly between them. Charlotte stared at the picture longer than she intended. For years she had built companies, negotiated deals, and managed thousands of employees. Yet sitting inside that modest workshop beside a 10-year-old girl, she suddenly realized something surprising. Ethan had already built something far more valuable than wealth. He had built a home filled with trust. And for the first time in a very long while, Charlotte Hayes found herself wondering what it might feel like to belong to one. The following Thursday evening, Charlotte found herself driving toward Maple Creek again, though this time she had no business reason she could easily explain. The sun had already slipped below the horizon, leaving streaks of orange and gold across the midwestern sky. Small porch lights flickered on throughout town while families gathered around dinner tables and children rode bicycles through quiet neighborhoods. It was a world completely different from the glass towers and endless meetings that defined most of Charlotte's life. She told herself she was simply checking on a potential community partnership. The explanation sounded reasonable until she realized she had driven 40 miles alone after a 12-hour workday just to see one man. When she arrived at the workshop, the lights were off. For a brief moment she felt disappointed. Then she noticed Ethan's pickup parked beside the curb near the town cemetery. Curiosity led her there. The cemetery rested on a gentle hill overlooking Maple Creek. Ancient oak trees swayed softly in the evening breeze while rows of white headstones caught the last traces of fading sunlight. Charlotte stepped carefully along a narrow path and soon spotted Ethan sitting quietly on a wooden bench. He had not noticed her. His attention remained fixed on a single gravestone decorated with fresh flowers. Charlotte immediately understood. She considered leaving. Instead, she remained still beneath the shade of a nearby tree. Ethan sat alone for several minutes. No phone. No distractions. No audience. Just silence. Finally, he spoke softly. "Lily got an A on her science project today." A faint smile touched his face. "You would have been proud of her." Charlotte lowered her eyes. Something about the moment felt deeply personal. Ethan continued speaking as if sharing ordinary updates with someone still sitting beside him. He described Lily's latest drawings. A customer who finally picked up a dining table. The bakery owner who continued over baking cinnamon rolls every Friday. Small details. Everyday details. Yet each one carried affection. Grace. Love that had not disappeared simply because years had passed. Charlotte felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. She had spent much of her adult life chasing goals, solving problems, and building success. Yet standing there in the gathering twilight, she realized she had never witnessed devotion quite like this. Eventually Ethan rose from the bench and turned. Only then did he see her. Surprise crossed his face. "Charlotte?" She stepped forward awkwardly. "I am sorry. I did not mean to intrude." Ethan glanced back toward the gravestone. "You did not." For a moment neither spoke. The evening air carried the scent of freshly cut grass while distant church bells echoed through town. Finally Charlotte asked the question that had quietly lived in her mind for weeks. "Do you ever wish you had chosen differently?" Ethan looked at the headstone again. The name Emily Walker glowed softly beneath the fading light. "No," he answered. "Not even for a second. Even knowing what you gave up." Charlotte asked. Ethan smiled gently. Especially knowing what I gained. The simplicity of the answer struck her harder than any speech she had ever heard. There was no bitterness in his voice. No regret. No resentment toward life. Only gratitude. As darkness slowly settled across the hilltop, Charlotte realized something else. Somewhere between the workshop, the rainy afternoon with Lily, and this quiet cemetery bench, she had stopped trying to understand Ethan Walker. She had started admiring him. And that realization frightened her far more than she wanted to admit. 3 weeks after that evening at the cemetery, Charlotte Hayes walked into the executive boardroom expecting another routine quarterly review. Instead, she stepped into the beginning of the most difficult chapter of her career. The atmosphere felt wrong immediately. Usually the room buzzed with quiet confidence. This morning it felt heavy. Tense. Several board members avoided eye contact. Others whispered among themselves before suddenly falling silent when she entered. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath a pale autumn sky, but inside the room the mood resembled an approaching storm. Charlotte took her seat at the head of the table. "Good morning," she said. No one answered with their usual enthusiasm. Then the reports began. A major acquisition she had personally approved was collapsing. Financial projections had been manipulated by a senior executive she trusted. Investors were demanding explanations. News outlets were already preparing stories questioning her leadership. By noon, her phone would not stop ringing. By evening, several business partners publicly distanced themselves from the company. The speed of the betrayal stunned her. People she had known for years suddenly became cautious. Friendly voices grew formal. Invitations disappeared. Promises evaporated. Success had always attracted attention. Failure revealed character. Late that night, Charlotte remained alone in her office. The city lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass while reflections danced across polished surfaces. Her assistant had gone home hours earlier. The cleaning crews had already finished their work. For the first time in years, silence filled the executive floor. Charlotte stared at the skyline without really seeing it. Exhaustion settled heavily across her shoulders. She thought about calling someone. A friend. A colleague. Anyone. Yet every name that came to mind felt connected to business. Transactions. Expectations. Appearances. Her phone vibrated. She glanced down. A simple text message appeared. Ethan Walker. Just 4 words. "How are you holding up?" Charlotte stared at the screen. No questions about the company. No curiosity about the headlines. No advice. Just concern. 10 minutes later she found herself driving toward Maple Creek. The roads were quiet. Cornfields stretched into darkness on either side of the highway. The farther she traveled from Chicago, the lighter she felt. When she arrived, lights still glowed inside the workshop. Ethan stood at a workbench, sanding the edge of a wooden bookshelf. He looked up as she entered. "Rough day?" he asked. Charlotte laughed softly. "That obvious?" "A little." She set her purse down and sank into a nearby chair. For several moments neither spoke. The workshop smelled of cedar and fresh coffee. A small radio played old country music in the background. Somewhere in the building, a clock ticked steadily. Ordinary sounds. Comforting sounds. Finally Charlotte exhaled. "Everything feels like it is falling apart." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes it does." She blinked. "That is not very encouraging." A faint smile touched his face. "Neither is pretending otherwise." Charlotte shook her head and laughed despite herself. Ethan poured coffee into a mug and handed it to her. Then he returned to sanding the bookshelf. No lecture. No attempt to solve her problems. Just quiet company. After several minutes Charlotte realized something remarkable. For the first time since the crisis began, she was breathing normally. The pressure in her chest had eased. The fear had softened. Nothing about her situation had changed. Yet somehow she no longer felt alone. And as she watched Ethan continue working beneath the warm workshop lights, Charlotte understood a truth she had spent years overlooking. Real strength was not found in the people who appeared when everything was going well. It was found in the ones who stayed when there was absolutely nothing to gain. The crisis at Hayes Holdings did not disappear overnight, but neither did Charlotte Hayes. Weeks passed. Investigations uncovered the truth behind the failed acquisition. Investors slowly regained confidence. Headlines moved on to other stories. Yet something inside Charlotte had changed. She spent less time chasing approval and more time paying attention to the people who remained when appearances no longer mattered. One cold November evening, she drove to Maple Creek again. The town square glowed beneath strings of holiday lights while families wandered between small shops carrying cups of hot chocolate. Snow flurries drifted lazily through the air, catching the light like tiny crystals. Charlotte found Ethan closing the workshop for the night. He was stacking lumber near the entrance while Christmas music played softly from an old radio. "You keep showing up," Ethan said with a smile. "I noticed." Charlotte laughed quietly. "Maybe I like it here." "Maybe." Ethan locked the front door and slipped the keys into his coat pocket. For a few moments they simply walked through town together. Neither seemed in a hurry. Their breath formed small clouds in the chilly evening air. The bakery windows glowed warm against the darkness. Somewhere nearby children laughed while building a snowman. It felt peaceful. Real. Eventually they reached the small town park where a massive Christmas tree stood decorated with thousands of white lights. Charlotte stopped walking. Ethan noticed the change immediately. "Everything okay?" he asked. She looked toward the tree. "Do you remember what my father said at the gala?" Ethan smiled faintly. "That depends. He says a lot of things. You know which one." Ethan nodded. Silence settled between them. The lights above reflected softly in the snow-covered ground. Charlotte folded her arms against the cold. "For a long time I thought strength meant never needing anyone." Her voice grew quieter. "I thought if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, controlled enough, I would never feel alone." Ethan listened without interrupting. "Then everything started falling apart," she continued. "And the people I expected to stay disappeared." A gust of wind stirred the branches overhead. Charlotte lowered her eyes. "Except you." Ethan looked at her carefully. The confidence that made boardrooms obey her seemed strangely absent tonight. For the first time, she looked vulnerable. Honest. Human. "My father thought you needed someone," Charlotte said softly. "Maybe he was right. Maybe we both did." Ethan remained quiet. She smiled nervously. "That sounded better in my head." A faint laugh escaped him. Then silence returned. The kind of silence that asks for truth. Finally Ethan spoke. His voice was calm. Steady. Certain. "Charlotte, I learned how to live alone a long time ago." She looked up. "Then what do you need?" Ethan glanced toward the glowing Christmas tree. Families moved around it laughing together beneath the lights. Then he met her eyes. "I do not need someone to rescue me." His words hung gently in the cold air. "What I want is someone brave enough to walk beside me." Charlotte froze. Every prepared response vanished. Every carefully constructed thought disappeared. She simply stared at him. The snowfall continued. The lights shimmered. Somewhere in the distance a church bell rang. Yet for several long seconds, Charlotte Hayes could not find a single word to say. Charlotte Hayes did eventually find her voice that night, but neither she nor Ethan ever forgot the silence that came first. Some answers were too honest to respond to immediately. Some truths arrived so gently that they changed a life before a person even realized it. Winter settled fully over Illinois in the months that followed. Snow covered the streets of Maple Creek. Holiday decorations gave way to quiet January mornings. The crisis at Hayes Holdings gradually faded into the past as investigations cleared Charlotte of wrongdoing and exposed the decisions made by others. Investors returned. Confidence returned. Stability returned. Yet Charlotte discovered that the thing she valued most was no longer waiting in a corporate boardroom. It was waiting 40 miles away in a small woodworking shop beside a bakery that always smelled like cinnamon. She visited often. Sometimes for lunch. Sometimes for coffee. Sometimes with no reason at all beyond wanting to spend time with Ethan and Lily. What surprised her most was how natural it felt. There were no games. No pretenses. No negotiations disguised as conversations. Ethan remained exactly who he had always been. Quiet. Honest. Steady. And slowly, Charlotte stopped feeling like a visitor in Maple Creek. She started feeling at home. By the following autumn, Richard Hayes could barely hide his satisfaction. "You look happier," he told his daughter during Sunday dinner. Charlotte smiled over her coffee cup. "Maybe." Richard laughed. "You sound exactly like him now." Several months later, beneath a clear October sky, friends and family gathered beside the restored gazebo overlooking the lake on the Hayes estate. The same gazebo where Richard had first met Ethan. The same gazebo that had quietly changed the direction of 3 lives. The ceremony was simple. No media. No publicity. No famous guests. Just people who genuinely cared about one another. Golden leaves drifted across the water while sunlight filtered through the trees. Ethan stood waiting in a dark suit. Charlotte walked toward him with a calm smile that carried none of the pressure she used to wear in corporate photographs. For the first time in years, she was not trying to become someone. She was simply herself. The vows were brief. Honest. Heartfelt. Exactly the way Ethan wanted them. Exactly the way Charlotte needed them. When the ceremony ended, applause echoed softly across the lakeshore. People laughed. Hugged. Celebrated. Yet the moment everyone remembered happened later during the reception. Lily stood holding a small bouquet of white flowers while Charlotte knelt beside her. The little girl hesitated. For only a second. Then she wrapped her arms around Charlotte and smiled. "I have wanted to ask something for a long time," Lily said. Charlotte blinked back tears. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lily's smile widened. "Can I call you Mom now?" Silence followed. Not the silence of shock. Not the silence of uncertainty. The silence of a room full of people witnessing something beautiful. Charlotte covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Ethan looked away briefly, overwhelmed by gratitude. Richard Hayes quietly lowered his head and smiled. And in that perfect moment, nobody cared about wealth, titles, companies, or success. Because sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding someone who changes your life. It is finding someone who walks beside you while you become the person you were always meant to be.